Yeah, so we'll start. We're going to be just going down this little path across the road in a minute, but just to get you oriented. So my name again is Keith. I live just down the road. We'll pass it on the way out as we're done. But where you are right now is actually part of the Chase farm, Chase family farm. And it was until the 1940s the Mason farm. And it was the Mason farm from 1690 to the 1940s. Um, and Chase family bought it in the 1940s. And they were one of the very first families right around 1980 to sell the development rights to the state of Rhode Island as a part of, and get an agricultural easement on it. So it's only usable right now as farmland, and help start a whole land conservation movement that's still kind of perking along. But because it was one of the earlier properties to do that, the rules are in the deed are a little bit different than you'd find in one of those arrangements now. In the middle 1990s, late 1990s, the Chase family decided to sell off half of their farm, and because it was split by the boundary between Massachusetts to the north and Rhode Island, where we are, to the south, they were allowed to do that, and that part of the property is also has an agricultural restriction on it. But that was bought by a doctor from Barrington, Charlie McCoy, and he continues to own it. So there's about a 240-acre farm altogether, but it's actually split in two by ownership. I'll say, like, my interest in the property is somewhat along the lines of the Soames Heritage Area project and the history and Margaret's Rock, where we're going to go. I'm a cultural historian by training, a teacher, but my bigger interest, or at least as big interest, is just in what's happening to land out here, partly because of the farming and agriculture, partly because of climate change, sea level rise. This is a really changeable geography that we're on, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that. But the reason that matters immediately is the Buster Chase, Bob Chase, who was the lead farmer out here for decades, passed away about 8 years ago, and his widow really hasn't been able to figure out what she wants to do next for a host of reasons, and there's family complications. So like back you were saying about the gardens, people are always more complicated than engineering, right? So and Charlie's got a kind of similar situation, a little more stable, but he really doesn't know what he wants to do with the land. So the farming nature of this property is, from one point of view, really deteriorating, not through anybody's bad intention, but just because it's not clear what the path forward is. The open commercial land like this right here, it's about a 6-acre field, is leased from one or the other of the owners, almost all of it by the Clegg family that runs Four Town Farm. And they're really an awesome family. They help out with the community garden that is on Charlie's land, and that's been going on for years. There's gleaning that happens out here. So they're a very community-minded family. They're also really excellent farmers, and a couple of the family and the younger generation have been to school to learn sustainable and environmentally sound farming practices. But the commercial environment that they work in makes it really hard to do those and keep their heads above water. So what they do is they do the best they can, and they use very little of all the chemicals, but they use them, and it still deteriorates the soil out here, the ecology out here in a variety of ways. So I'll show you a couple of places. This field's not too bad, but I would argue that a lot of the farming soil out here is actually kind of dead soil right now. And without the chemical inputs, it's not going to be very productive. So there's likely to be a transition coming up as it moves to more sustainable practices. But it's an ongoing conversation. There's no good guys or bad guys in it. It's just like, how do we make this work? And because of the generational change happening, it's just a really funky conversation. The reason I'm mentioning that and spending some minutes on it is that I think that is a pretty relevant description for almost any farm of this kind in New England right now. They're all in the middle of this, some kind of version of this process, so it's something to be thinking about.
Tri-town?
Four town farm.
Four town.
Yep, yep. Yeah, they're located, as a crow flies, probably a mile and a half from here, driving a little bit further. But anyway, north, south, east, and west, and we're just going to go in, make a loop through a little trail through the woods, come out in a meadow, pass by my house, and end up back here. It's probably a little less than a mile. But what I'll share with you is kind of my take on the sort of human history here a little bit, particularly that moment of contact between European and native settlers on this land, and talk a little bit about that, and we'll visit Margaret's Rock and spend most of our time there. But if there's questions you've got at any point, but given who's here, and this has been Dave's and my experience with every single group that's gone through, you all probably know a lot of details or stories or things you've heard or resources. Please feel free to jump in and share and kind of be the storyteller for a couple of minutes. That's really why I continue to do this, is it's the best way I have of learning more about what's going on out here. So it's really a collective project. So, but anyway, let's head on down, and first little pond we're going to go past is actually now considered a little wetland waterway, but it's actually a stream and pond dug out by the farmers who were here probably in the 1930s, maybe in the 1920s. And some of it's starting to silt back in now. So. The other thing that's maybe worth knowing, to a total of about 900 acres of open, undeveloped land, only about 50 acres of which could even theoretically be developed. And it fits into 2 towns, 2 water districts, 15 private owners. Like, it's just, and we have, a group of us are starting to get some interest in trying to see if we can help coordinate sort of a strategy, if not a coherent plan for what happens next. So it's a really amazing property to be in the middle of. It's so gorgeous, yeah. Yeah. I think they kept horses out here for a long time.
Oxen.
Could have been oxen too.
Gigantic.
Yeah, so we, when we crossed that stream, that is more or less the boundary between Massachusetts, where we are now, and Rhode Island. And that's kind of the boundary between the Chase family portion of the farm and now Charlie McCoy's portion of the farm. So, and one of the other things you can notice is just all the trees in here are roughly within a very narrow age range and pretty young. So it's a pretty good clue this was open land until probably 30, 40 years ago. Just 2 really quick things here. If you look just to where I'm pointing over here, you can see that there's a little spine of stone that kind of starts and then comes up, a little ridge right through there. Can you see that? Just through the trees. And it'll become more obvious as we walk down. But that pops up, goes for a little way to where we'll cut through, and then dives back under. And the one we were talking about over here on Route 136 on Market Street, so there's 6 of those spines of stone that run for about 7 or 8 miles north and south, parallel to each other, and they pop up and then they dive under, and then they pop up and dive under, and they kind of alternate next to each other. And sometimes they're only a few hundred yards apart, and other times, it's more like a half mile apart. But that geology really defines the ecology here and the way water moves and kind of everything else that follows. But we'll get a really good sense of it where we're going, but just something to look at as we're going through. They're all left over from the Laurentide Glacier about 13,000 years ago. It receded, and the best guess is that the Pokanoket that moved into this area probably came a couple thousand years after that, so about maybe 10,000 years ago. It's kind of 8 to 10. So yeah, this, it's all glacial, and it's all metamorphic rock, which means basically sludge that got compressed by really, really deep ice into something that looks hard and kind of isn't. It's not quite pudding stone, but sometimes it is. Yeah, yeah, but this will flake or crack, you know, in response to ice and water. There's also, I've read about, there was a stagecoach that went from Swansea down to Bristol and then somehow from over here up to Worcester. And what I've heard is that there was a stagecoach house right near the corner where you turn to come down the dirt road there. And it looks like there's a couple of tracks going through the woods that could also just be where trees have fallen and kind of torn out some big chunks in a row, which happens. But it could equally be part of an old stagecoach road. So the other way to be thinking about this is that this would have also been a pretty active area in some different ways at different points in time. So, yeah. And it probably would have come here and then turned up the... Yeah, so we'll stop here for a minute just for a few things. One is this open field out here belongs to another farm family, and that's the D'Alessandro family. You passed it coming down this way, just across, kind of across from Johnson's Market, kind of across. And Mr. D'Alessandro passed away probably about another 6 years ago-ish, and his children have inherited the farm, and they're kind of like the farms over here. They want to be good caretakers, preserve it, but they really don't have, like, you know, one's a lawyer, one does something else. Like, this isn't what they do. So it's been kind of sitting, leasing out the hay, leasing out the agricultural land, but it's not clear what's going to happen. And slowly, it's kind of filling in and changing a little bit. But that's about 80 acres of land, also protected, so it's not going to be developed at least, but not clear what's going to happen with it. You can kind of see Four Town Farm is, this is where they get a lot of their pumpkins. You can kind of see out in some of the fields there, a lot of squash. They're bummed. They make more money with ornamental stuff like that than they actually do selling food, and they love to grow food, so they're kind of... but anyway, the major reason for pausing right here is that the numbers are a little open to interpretation, but probably in this greater southern New England area, there were maybe a total of 100,000 or so native people pre-European arrival. And the Pokanoket were a band of probably, how many, Dave, would you say?
No more than 7,000.
Yeah. And most estimates put it at about 5,000 and kind of spread pretty wide geographically. And there was a plague that went through starting in 1617 or so, peaked in 1619, that for the 4,000 or 5,000 Pokanoket that were in this area, ended up killing probably 60 to 90% of them, depending, probably leptospirosis. Most likely there's some evidence that it came from a European ship's crew that they interacted with. And that matters for a whole bunch of reasons. One is it's kind of a cautionary tale for the pandemic we've just been through, I think. But more for historical reasons, it completely transformed the politics of this region, the intertribal politics. So there had always been tension between the Pokanoket and the Narragansett over kind of who had the rights to certain lands and who was the dominant power in this region and all. And they mostly kept each other kind of at a standoff. When this leptospirosis pandemic went through with such a high mortality rate, it ended up really destroying the cultural fabric of the Pokanoket, because just, who's here to bury anybody? Who's here to maintain the customs? It was pretty indiscriminate in terms of age, so it, left a lot of kids on their own, and, just et cetera, et cetera. But also, it did not affect the Narragansetts hardly at all, and it meant that they were numerically still really strong, they were culturally still very intact, and it greatly weakened the Pokanoket, who were afraid that they would just be completely pushed out now. And one of their incentives, we'll go a little up to Margaret's Rock in just a minute, which is where the Massasoit met with Roger Williams when Roger Williams was on his way to found Providence, what became Providence. And part of the Massasoit's willingness to make a treaty with Roger Williams and support his adventures was he needed an English ally who he felt could help ward off the Narragansett interests in this land. And it kind of worked. I mean, it was so part of the reason I want to make a real point of that is that people on the whole tend to think of the politics of that era as being primarily about European native people pushing back and forth. There's certainly a lot of that, but the European side of it is all these multiple interests, British, French, even Russian, and so on, kind of all vying with each other. But it's also all the tribes are very politically astute, and they're making and moving alliances with each other out of what they perceive as their own interests. And so it's a real movable political environment, and the dynamics of that matter a lot in really understanding kind of why things unfolded as they did. So, so if there's interest in, we could talk a little bit more about that regionally. Last thing maybe I'll say here before we head up to Margaret's Rock, thinking about those alliances and contact, one of the major differences in European and indigenous ways of thinking about land is around the concept of ownership. And Europeans had an idea of, deeds and individual ownership of property, and actually made property ownership one of the major planks of British law. For Native Americans, there was not a sense of ownership. There was a sense, most Native American tribal names translate into something like the first people or the people from here. And the reason for that is there was an idea that we are who we are because we're from this place, and we're part of the environment, part of the ecology, and we have a certain role to fulfill as a part of it, and that means taking care of it in certain ways. So the concept is here, and in a lot of Native thinking about property then, was what are now called usufruct rights, the right to use land. So very often I might negotiate with you so that you can come in and harvest blueberries, you can come in and hunt deer, you can come in and look for mushrooms, or whatever for water and so on. But I'm granting and negotiating a right of use, not a right of ownership. And those are always relational. They're always kind of up for discussion, negotiation. So one of the mysteries in this is, how do Europeans come in and claim ownership besides just taking it, with the point of a gun? And there's a lot of that. But basically, there was an argument about natural rights that the Europeans made, which was, since this land is undeveloped, the Indians have a natural right to it, but they don't have a legal right to it. And because progress is about developing the land, we have a dominant right to take it and develop it into something civilized. That's not a consensus argument by the Europeans. Roger Williams stands with the Indians, he loses. So that kind of matters, but thinking about that that kind of tension and these really different concepts of ownership, I think matters a lot. So So we'll head up to Margaret's Rock. Yeah,
We're
sure.
heading to Margaret's Rock.
Sure.
How is it that Roger Williams up in Salem in the winter heads this way? Did he have relations with the Pokanoket
Yeah.
from the time he came over at 1630?
Yeah, the Massasoit Usamakwen from here was part of the group that had gone up to the Pilgrims for the first Thanksgiving feast, and that route back and forth was a pretty well traveled route, and yeah, Roger Williams had a prior relationship, knew, and so I doubt that the Pokanoket band that was here knew he was coming, but it wouldn't have been a surprise that if he was going someplace, this would have been where he went. Yeah. And he was obviously being chased out for his heresy and kind of the politics of all that. But yeah, right. But so it's actually a lovely place to hike, is out there along the boundary, and you can cut back into the woods and then come back down. It's one of my favorite hikes out here. Yeah. Yeah, we'll just head up this way. This really lovely yellow leafed stand here is clethra, or summer sweet, which was historically used for soap making. It's also a favorite of bees, and produces a really, really awesome honey. And in the places that it likes, it grows like a weed, and in places it doesn't like, there's nothing you can do to get it to grow. So I don't know a lot about soil science and all that, but it's apparently an indicator species for all kinds of interesting things. So, clethra, C-L-E-T-H-R-A, or summer sweet is another common name. Yeah. Back edge of this farm pasture we were just looking at is another one of these big ridges, and it ends just over here, kind of comes down and comes to an end, and Margaret's Rock is tucked right into the end of that. But this runs north for about a third of a mile, half a mile, and then dives back underneath also. So this is Margaret's Rock. This is the big monument of sorts.
Well, why is it called Margaret's Rock?
Margaret was a wife of the Massasoit of Usamakwen, and there's a number of different stories about her that I've heard. One is that she was also the last self-identified Pokanoket person to be out here well into her old age, and it was named as kind of a memorial to her, in the aftermath of King Philip's War. I've also heard that she was part of the welcoming committee for Roger Williams and was significant in caring for him, and this was kind of home base for that. So I think when I first got here, the apocryphal story, and one that I really like a lot, is that this was actually where Roger Williams would have been cared for, lean-to over and against this, a nice little fire going in that corner, and you could stay pretty toasty for a long time. Chances are pretty good to be more historically accurate. We'll go over onto this little bench over on the side here in just a minute, and that's probably where the winter camp for the Pokanoket were. And given that, it's much more likely that he was cared for in one of the weetus that they had over on that bench. And this might have been more of a place to sit and whatever. But part of the reason this is such an interesting spot is I've been out here almost every day for the better part of a decade now, and every kind of weather imaginable. And where you're standing right now, there's been 3 or 4 foot snowdrifts, and then from about this line in, nothing, right? So it stays dry, it keeps you out of all the weather, and it would be a pretty good place to know about. Probably used to overhang a little bit more. You can see some of the slabs that have come down. You all know the story, kind of Roger Williams leaving up north of Boston, being sort of coming down here. Is that familiar, part of it? So he ends up here. One of the questions that interest me as a cultural historian is how do you tell that story? And it's not that there's a true version of it, but it's that there's a bunch of versions that have a part of the truth in them, right? And this monument, this little plaque here, is put up by the Roger Williams Family Association. So the heirs of Roger Williams, they came out about a decade ago and were memorializing their connection, and they installed this. And it's really problematic. And I've talked with them directly about it, and they're aware of it and kind of thinking it through. So again, it's not good guys and bad guys, it's just kind of a conversation. But Margaret is in tiny, tiny little letters at the top of this. And the Pokanoket lived here for 8,000 years, and Roger Williams lived here for a month. You know, it's kind of like there's just a version of whose story it is, right? Held by tradition, Chief Massasoit, and as Dave often points out, the word Massasoit is Pokanoket for chief. So it really is saying held by tradition, chief, and Margaret. So it's like it's evidence of like a not knowing the history of the people that they're talking about. It's kind of this second or third hand, pretty romanticized notion. And it's not that they're doing it willfully, it's kind of that's what they had learned. Both of the Wampanoag tribe, and the Wampanoag did not, which is an alliance of 5 tribes, did not refer to themselves as the Wampanoag. That was a later name given to this constellation of tribes, and they would have referred to themselves as just their own tribal name and had an alliance. And because the Pokanoket, according to the Pokanoket elders today, through their oral traditions, they were the leadership tribe for this alliance. So their argument is more commonly they would have been referred to, all of them, as the Pokanoket, right? Some of the other tribes dispute that. So there's, there's another whole version of that conversation. But they nursed an ill Roger back to health during that very cold winter of 1636. Following his banishment from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That part of it's all pretty accurate. And then, he went from here down to eventually what became Providence.
What was the month that he crossed over the Seacount?
Well, he was here, Dave might know more, so the calendars also change, right? And we lose about a month one way or the other as the calendars shift. But he arrived here mostly for the month of February. And then went down in March, kind of camped on the wrong side, got booted over to the other side, and then, so that probably would have been more like April, May.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm guessing, yeah. And that land that he went to, I've heard various claims on it, but the most persuasive story I've heard about where Providence is now is that it was a kind of a neutral space, mostly managed by the Narragansett, but it was a place where a lot of the regional tribes kind of touched, and it would have needed a lot of agreement to have the Europeans settle there peacefully, which happened. So that was, as a number of folks have pointed out, there was a 50-year peace following, almost 50-year peace following Roger Williams' arrival here. So pretty.
Did you say he was married to them?
Yes, he was. He left his wife and children
No,
behind.
I mean Margaret.
Yeah, they were. She was a wife of Samaquin, who was the, who is the Massasoit. So his title was Massasoit.
Was she a Sockham too? Then she would. Her name would have been Margaret.
To my knowledge, there's no information about her at all. So there's also, if I was going to be a little pushy about this from a real contemporary point of view, there's also a real gendered history being told here, because she clearly was a player here. She clearly was involved in care. She probably participated in a lot of the decision making, and all we know is her European name, and that she was married to the big guy. Like, it's kind of a.
That's all we really know of her, just the European.
Yeah, so it's so much more to kind of continue to explore here for sure. Yeah. My thought is, well, a few more comments is we can just stand here too if people want, but little trail we can follow up to this bench, and I think you can get a real sense of why this would have been such a desirable spot to be. Probably is just a winter camp, not a year-round camp, probably only every other winter or so, and probably for a group of only 150, 200 people at a time. So, but yeah, the other thing that gets interesting in that question about where Margaret's roots might have been is that I think in U.S. history, we have such deeply entrenched notions about race and ethnicity that we think of those as components of identity and sort of impermeable, like they don't move very easily. And I think for a lot of tribal cultures, much more permeable boundaries and much more elastic concepts. So you could come from the Nipmuc and become a Pokanoket. It wasn't, and it was like you changed who you were with, not who you were, if that makes sense. So, you know, it's really fascinating stuff to dive into, yeah.
And we weren't there.
And we weren't there, right? So what do we know? Yeah, let's head up this little, watch your foot, this is a little rougher. So you saw it comes up about 35 feet pretty steeply, little crest, and there's a little overgrown, but there's a trail along the whole top of that crest. Drops down about half the height to this bench that's fairly wide and runs almost the full length of the ridge, and then drops the rest another 15 feet down to the main trail that you can walk on, or probably was the travel path for forever. But this is most likely where the camp was, and it makes a lot of sense strategically. There, we've had a military historian, colonial military historian named Jamie Warren, who's written a lot about this era, come out and look it over, and he concurs. And we've had the elders from the Pokanoket out several times to look, and they kind of concur. So we don't have any archaeological evidence, but we have a lot of story evidence, and then some. It just makes sense. And the reasons it makes sense, same way I was saying about Margaret's Rock, is almost all of the really bad weather we get here in the winter months comes out of the northwest. And this is completely protected from those big northwest storms. Because it's on a bench with a little slope, even if we get a heavy rain or a lot of snow that then melts, it's going to run down below, so it's easy to keep dry. And staying dry is probably the biggest key to staying warm and healthy and so on. It's also a really defensible position. So if you're concerned about being attacked mostly by Narragansetts, you could easily have somebody positioned as a lookout, get a sense of it early, and then they're coming, probably not trying to come up the cliff, but coming up this way, and you're in a really defensible position, so kind of works militarily. It's in a really food-rich environment even today, and it would have been even more so then. And it's not very far from a choice of water sources. It's also probably only a half-mile from what would have been a likely summer camp right down on the banks of the river over here, you know, an estuary where there'd be also shellfish and fishing and all kinds of things that you could still do in the winter if you wanted to, but get easy access to. So chances are pretty good this was where it was. And it would have been wooden semi-permanent structures called witus for families of, or group of people, 10 or 12 people at a time, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And they would have lasted multiple seasons and then been replaced. But so the other feature that I try a lot to imagine out here, and there's a lot of really good environmental history being done right now around this, is I've heard so many competing stories about what the land used to look like and then what it looked like 50 years after Europeans arrived. And the dominant story is all big trees, and then Europeans arrived, chopped them all down for firewood in mass, and within 50 years, you know, the tree line had receded 50 miles inland. The evidence actually is that that didn't happen that way. That what had happened, in fact, is that the tribes, bless you, had regular practices of fires that they burned the land. They typically did it twice a year. And the way forests work is some species have really thick bark, and they're very, very resistant to fire. So if you burn off the underbrush, you're going to get rid of all the underbrush, and the trees that can be resistant to fire are going to survive and thrive. They're going to get bigger and bigger. So white pine is a really good example of that. So what, in some hardwoods, some of the bigger oaks and things. So, and beech survives differently. It actually has a pretty thin skin. But the result was that these forests around here did not look very much like this. They had very little undergrowth and these really big tree canopies. And you could see through them for 25, 50, 100 feet, 100 yards at a time. So we think of it as nature, but it was a really, really highly managed economy, kind of a subsistence economy. And what I mentioned earlier is that Europeans came in and looked and said, oh, they haven't done anything with the land, like they're just wasting it. You know, it's a great resource, so it's up to us. Just simply isn't true. They had created what was basically nature's food locker for their interests. So you could get, even right now, I'll come down 6 or 7 in the morning to this field out here, and right now I'll see usually 2 groups of deer, maybe 6 or 8 deer in each group, one here and one at the other end. And these days, each of those deer is accompanied by a flock of maybe 15 turkeys. So like, you could eat pretty well, you know, if you have a small number and you're not over harvesting. A lot of nut trees, a lot of the trees themselves have parts that are edible or usable, a lot of roots that are usable, edible, access to things in the water. I've counted, I think at this point, 15 different mushroom varieties, some of which are edible out here. I'm not a mushroomer, so I don't eat them, but people who do tell me, you know, it's pretty rich. So you start thinking, a lot of small animals, so it'd be a really, really easy place to get through the winter most of the time. A lot of firewood and so on. So.
No archaeological evidence. Has there been a dig here or not?
There's been some toes in the water, is my understanding. I've not been here for any of them. There have been a couple of small efforts where we were looking back, where I stopped down at that little corner. And the reason for stopping at that corner is that the one written history of this from, when is Virginia Baker writing?
1904.
1904, is that 275 paces to the west of Margaret's Rock is the burial area for the tribe that was here. So if you pace off 275 steps due west, you end up right in that little corner where we were. And in fact, there's a little bit of subsidence in the soil, and but that could be from so many different things, right? There's no reason to think that there would be physical remains from people who died and were buried 400 years ago without metal objects, right? So everything probably deteriorated, particularly if it's happening and so after sort of a mass die-off event, people would have just been put in pretty hurriedly. So a little bit of digging around there that has been done hasn't really turned up anything. But there's also the ethics of digging into all this that on the whole, people have leaned more towards respecting than letting the curiosity take them. On the other hand, there are these metal detector guys that like to come out here, and they're really, like, if you want to have a fun day, walk around with them, because they know a lot of history and are really curious, and they also find things, which makes it kind of a blast. And they have found a number of artifacts over the years that also are pretty suggestive. Some metal with their metal detectors, but a lot of arrowheads and, you know, pot shards and things like that. Their most exciting finding is they found a silver shoe buckle from probably 1640s, 1650s, you know, so. The other part of this history that gets complicated is that there's this brief period of maybe 30, 40 years of relative peace. European settler pressures increase. King Philip, one of Osamakwen's sons, decides that it's time for last stand effort to get them out of their territory, and so starts King Philip's War. Year and a half later, they've lost pretty badly, and there's a few consequences of that, many, but a couple for the Pokanoket in particular. One is that they are essentially erased from the landscape. They're taken into slavery. They're forced out to join other tribes, like some of those, the Passamaquoddy in southern Maine, for example. And the colonial legislature passes rules that outlaw the practice of Pokanoket customs or the speaking of the Pokanoket language. And my understanding is that those laws are not formally repealed until the 1940s. So some of the tribal politics of it are that they cease to exist, but tribes like the Mashpee on the Cape, where I grew up, do now have federal recognition, and they don't feel like they feel like the Pokanoket really disappeared and aren't here anymore, and the Pokanoket heirs are making claims that they are. So it's just, the politics continues as a kind of one way to think about it. So that's a really, probably the most important thing. The other is for just this particular property, a number of the Pokanoket who sort of drift into the background to survive around here continue to come out and think of themselves as Pokanoket and practice some of their customs and ceremonies. And the apocryphal story is that the Mason family, which is given the first land grant of this land in 1690, is actually pretty amicable with those survivors and allows them to cross through, hunt on, use the land. We mentioned a big erratic on the other side of 136. There's another really, really big one on the south end of the farm. The story is that was where a lot of Pokanoket women went to give birth. They kind of had a sort of good energy for that. And they continued to do that long after the King Philip's War ended. So, there's just a lot to continue to try to unearth. But I'll be really surprised if there is an archaeological effort out here. I just think, especially now that we've drawn in the Pokanoket elders and leaders into this process, I can't imagine that they'd be supportive of that, and they really have to honor their part in this. So, it wasn't have one place that you farmed year after year after year after year. It would have been pick a promising area, burn and then girdle the trees so that you get a lot of light in, kills the trees, a lot of light in, farm in between the trunks and the stumps, and do a mixture of, the sort of three sisters farming of, beans, corn, and squash. And that, with a little bit of fish stuff thrown in for some extra fertilizer, and that gives a really nitrogen-rich environment for growing. But corn is just a really horrible thing to grow in terms of soil maintenance. It just sucks everything out and gives very little back. So probably after 4 or 5 years, maybe even 3 or 4 years, depending on where you start, you'd move over to another location. So even if it was a bigger area like this. So what I have to think is, since it would take multiple years to have a canopy die off and be ready for the next planting, there's probably a really consistent plan of how we're going to move this, and thinking, 3, 4, 7, 8 years ahead to just kind of have this. So again, really highly managed food production all through here. Keep in mind too, they're living in these little settlements or villages of 150, 200 people, which means that in any given winter, there's probably 10 or a dozen of those scattered around, right? And I doubt very much that people stayed always in the same one. It's like, oh, she's kind of cute. I think I'm going to go live over with her if her family will let me. And, so I'm just that. I mean, people would be moving around, all the time. Of high points, that would be used for communication, kind of smoke or fire at night. And one of them is right on Joetta's property. There's a hill right next to the silo that's still there that actually was built up by people carrying loose rocks up and building it up. They probably built it up an extra 10 feet, 12 feet. So a lot of material went up there. But you remember the cooling towers in Fall River when they took those down? Well, I watched them come down, but I watched it from the top of that pile of rock. Because you could, and that's a good 10 miles, 12 miles down the way, right? So there was also this interlinking of all these different communities, and I don't know like the density of information they communicated, but you could pass along certain kinds of things using this pretty elaborate system. Back to your point that everything changes, you know, part of my fascination with what's going on here is climate change is affecting this profoundly already. The density of different species of trees out here is changing, and it's changing because of weather events and insect events. So things like gypsy moths, you know, we had a summer where we had had 3 previous summers of drought, really weakened the root systems on oak trees. And then this particular summer we had a gypsy moth infestation, cleaned out the canopy, and the trees usually can survive that and they grow back, which they did, second crop of leaves. Gypsy moths came in and cleaned them out again. And this happened in western Rhode Island a lot, not so much here, but it happened in a big chunk of the woods here. And the following year, everything started to leaf out and then died. And the trees' root systems had died, so everything started tipping over, and it looks like this graveyard of oak trees over here. And because of that, all of the undergrowth is starting to race in, and it's, in 5 years, that whole area is like almost impenetrable. It used to be a beautiful, easy place to walk. So there's those kinds of things happening. Where you came down Birch Swamp Road, it's called that because this was also part of what was known as the Great Birch Swamp. And it goes from the mouth of the Kickamuit up to what's now Route 6, right? And it kind of drains in from both sides and then is a swamp drainage area out into the Kickamuit watershed. But that watershed is already, the reservoir down there that they're taking the dams down for, is already getting saltwater infiltration coming in. So it's gone from brackish to too salty to sustain most plant life in it. And that's beginning to creep up into this area, and with another 8 inches, we've had about 8 inches of sea level rise already in this area, and with another 8 inches to a foot over the next 20 years, we're probably going to have standing water in areas that are now just damp after high tides or storm events kind of things. And part of my interest is not trying to control that, but really just trying to catalog it, just like really trying to understand what it is that's going on. I do have some self-interest where I live now. We're good for about 3 feet after that. And so I'm hoping this goes really slowly because I'd like to be gone before it's a problem, because I love living here. But it's not unthinkable that it's going to change who can be even in a place like this. So, and I think there are also ways that we can, much in the ways that native people adapted the land in a really harmonious way to their living here sustainably. I have to think that there are new ways that we can do that in environments like this for human habitation sustainably over the next 100 or 1,000 years. You know, and there's a lot of experiments around the world right now with what that looks like, and I'd love for this to become one of those sites. Again, without having any answers or any particular politics around it, just like, wow, how do these farms continue to produce food for people with all this going on? Like, that's something everybody can get behind, I think. So those kinds of questions. So as you go down Route 136 and you come to the stoplight where you turn right onto Market Street to go into Warren, that will be it's already flooding with king tide events, and it will be underwater with another less than a foot of sea level rise. It will be underwater 100% of the time, which means for somebody like me, if I want to run down to town, I'm now going to have to go a 5 or 6 mile journey around the other direction. For people in Bristol, it's really concerning because there's not a lot of ways to get off of Bristol depending where you live, you know, so it's the adaptation to these things is, you know, fortunately in Warren, I think the town is trying to get ahead of the game on it, so it feels pretty positive.
Trying to promote redevelopment away from Market Street.
Away from Market Street, and also just one of the things I was not aware of, Dave and I were at a meeting with the town planner. He was presenting some of his thinking about all this. I always kind of knew how much water moves underground, but I never realized the degree to which underground water movement determines so much of the engineering above ground. And one of the big issues for the town of Warren is that all of the underground hydraulic systems are going to change dramatically. And we don't really quite understand how, but it's going to make hardening a lot of these roads and habitable areas really, really challenging. Yeah, it's going to be. We can go right down this little trail and then out. It'd be kind of a nice little way to do it. Yeah, I can actually walk from here over, across a little stream, and be in the Swansea Water District pretty easily, or part of it. There's also an old dump that's been covered over there that you can end up in. Can get pretty much, getting up to Route 6 is easy, getting a little further to the east is a little swampier, so it has to be pretty dry to do that.
How did they originate? Do you know?
Some of them I'm sure go way, way back, but there were also been a lot of different uses. We won't go to it, but there's a couple of spots on the farm here that have been, they've used them for harvesting stone and gravel pits and rocks of different kinds. There's been some forestry work done out here. This was all open and probably was mostly animal husbandry, probably mostly dairy for a lot of its history. So a lot of these would have just been usage roads. Yeah. Yeah. This field right here is about 3 acres. And you can see it's also Four-Town Farm again, but they've got it all ornamentals for Halloween and Thanksgiving, pretty much.
So I'm surprised at Johnson Farm. They just farm their